Thank you all so much for having me here today. It's great to be back on campus at Berkeley. I feel like I graduated from the MIDS program in 2016, and so I haven't been back here since my immersion. And it's thrilling to be back here. I feel like it's one of those places where you walk on campus and I immediately get a little bit smarter. There's something in the air. It's really exciting. When the iSchool folks asked me to speak today, they said, I said, what should I talk about? They said, whatever you want. I said, OK. So with that in mind, in what will likely be the least technical talk you hear today, I want to share a couple questions that have been rattling around in my head and hopefully get them rattling around in all of your heads. I want to start by talking about two things. This is going to be a thread that we keep coming back to. I want to talk about power. You have power just by virtue of being in the job that you're in. Data scientists, as the other speakers have alluded to this as well, data scientists have the power to set the terms of the analytical conversation at their organizations. They have influence over the kinds of questions that management asks. They get to set the terms of the models that get used, the analyses that come out of there, and ultimately the products that go into production as a result of that. That's a lot of responsibility. And something that I think it's critical for us all to engage with as data scientists. So I'm going to talk about power today. I also want to talk about framing. Hillary spoke about framing in our opening keynote today. I'm going to come at it from a little bit of a different angle here. But what I really want to highlight is the notion of how important language is when we're thinking about not just the kinds of questions that we're asking as data scientists, but the people who will be affected by the answers to those questions. Language matters a lot here. We're going to keep coming back to framing as well. So before I get into that, let me give you a little bit of context about me and my organization and why I'm here. As John said, I work at an organization called Global Giving. We are the first and largest crowdfunding community for global nonprofits. We are a nonprofit organization ourselves. Registered 501c3 here in the US. We're also registered in London, or in England rather, and China. And our mission statement is to transform aid and philanthropy and accelerate community-led change. Now, what that actually boils down to in practice is that we work with thousands of social good organizations all around the world to get them connected with the money, the information, the ideas, the trainings, the networks they need to execute on their missions, whatever they may be. And just to give you a brief glimpse of the kind of diversity of organizations that we have, we might be working on any given day with a women's organization in India, with a farming program in Peru. One of my personal favorites is this organization in Tanzania that trains giant African pouched rats to sniff out landmines. It's just the coolest thing. We also do a lot of work with disaster relief, even here in the US, responding to situations like Hurricane Harvey in Texas in 2017. These are organizations that operate in 170 countries. The diversity is vast, and the problem space is really complicated. Our team is not huge. There's only about 50 or 60 of us spread around the world. I'm part of our product team that consists of a handful of programmers, a couple of DevOps folks, and one and only data person, which is both exciting and really challenging. By virtue of working with these kinds of organizations, I find myself in a lot of conversations about this idea of data for good. This is probably a theme that you have heard of. It is increasingly, I think, a trend as the data science sector has matured. There's an increasing recognition of the impact beyond just the bottom line that data projects can have. I think this is really exciting. This is really good. And increasingly, there are working groups. There are organizations. I know there are people in the audience here today who have worked with DataKind in the past. They're one of the leaders in cultivating this conversation. Even here at the iSchool, there is within the Center for Technology, Society, and Policy, there's a Data for Good grant program. These are great advancements for the field that we're engaging with the social impact of the work that we can do. And as much as I am excited about this idea, I would like to kind of lovingly criticize it a little bit here today. I think it's great, and I think we can do even better. I think there's kind of a couple of different ways that we can improve on it. The first is that this idea of data for good implies a dichotomy of sorts. It implies that there's some bucket of stuff that counts as data for good, and over here there's this bucket of other stuff. Sometimes people will talk about that as corporate data science. I've heard people talk about it as for-profit versus non-profit data science. Usually it becomes a kind of shorthand for situations where people are working in organizations that have a purely financially focused bottom line versus organizations that have a double or triple bottom line. There's a lot of different ways to kind of describe the implied dichotomy here. But I think it's a little problematic because any way you slice it, if you have data for good, and you take that to its logical extension, you have this idea of data for bad, which is intrinsically ridiculous. There are no organizations or people other than Disney villains that describe themselves purely as bad for the sake of bad. That doesn't make any sense. And so I think cultivating this, a bit of a false dichotomy of there's things that are good and there's things that are bad, doesn't necessarily help us engage deeply with the idea of data for good in a way that will push the field forward. So, I said I was going to talk about power and framing. And I think before I get into that, I want to highlight that there is no, even if you imagine there is this dichotomy, that difference isn't really practical. I think there's a much more practical shift that we can make that accounts for this idea of power and framing. And that's what I want to spend the rest of my talk here today focusing on. So we have data for good. I would like to humbly propose that one way we might think of this is shifting a little bit from data for good to the notion of doing data with everyone. Now, that probably sounds like a small semantic change, a little bit of wordsmithing. I hear you. Bear with me. Where power and framing starts to get into this shift in thinking is in those second two words. Power is in the middle word. We're going from for to with. By definition, if you're doing something for somebody, you have power over that person. You have a thing that they don't have, whether it's a product or a skill, a talent, whatever it is, and you are either giving it to them or doing it for them. That implies a power dynamic that's impossible to ignore. I think this is part of what gets sticky about the idea of empowerment, which is a word you hear a lot in conversations, particularly in international development. If you can empower someone, that implies that you have power over them and you could take that power away. That's something that we need to engage with as leaders in the data science sector. Framing comes in switching from this very broad, almost flattening concept of good to something that much more specifically captures the complexity, the nuance, the diversity of viewpoints, individual viewpoints, in the problems that we're trying to solve. It's very hard to get people to agree on what is good. And I think particularly one of the things we can learn from successful and not successful development projects, international development projects, is the importance of accommodating for literally the nuance of everyone. That's why I like everyone instead of all here. We'll talk more about that in a second. So that's my proposal. What I would like to do now is tell a couple stories of places where I've seen this manifest either for better or for worse. Some of them come from the data context, others come from the international development context. So with that, I'll start with this guy. Does anybody recognize Mr. Mustache here? I would be, to date, no one ever has. This is a guy who's got a really interesting story. This man's name is Edmund Dene Morel. He went by E.D. Morel. And he was not a data scientist. That term wouldn't come along for another 120 years. But he was a data person in that he was a leader in his organization that was charged with exactly what I was saying earlier, asking the questions, setting the terms of the analysis, engaging with them in quantitative ways. E.D. Morel worked for a company called Elder Dempster. Elder Dempster was a shipping company that was based in Liverpool, 1890s or so. And they ran shipping networks across kind of Europe and further afield. The shipping lanes that E.D. Morel was responsible for overseeing, or at least maintaining the books on, were specifically the shipping lanes that ran from Central Africa up to Western Europe and back. And what I think is great about his story, and what we can learn about it even now 100 and some odd years later, is it's a very early example of someone who was attuned to the voices that were missing from a conversation, baked that into his work as a data person at his organization, and ultimately went around to shift his career accordingly. So, as I said, E.D. Morel is looking at the ledger books of shipments going to and from Central Africa, and he's noticing something kind of strange. He's noticing that there's a lot of wealth on the boats that are coming north. There's ivory, there's rubber, there's goods that are expensive to buy in Europe. So he figures, oh, they must have a really rich trading relationship with whomever they're dealing with down there. So he went and looked at the books for the ships headed south. What he did not find was a comparable amount of value going south. What he found were two things: guns and chains. Like I say, this is a story that does not get enough airtime in the history of data science. Because what E.D. Morel discovered, just in looking at the data sets he had access to, realizing that someone's voice was not getting heard, E.D. Morel became really the first person to, in Europe, uncover evidence of the atrocities that were happening in the Belgian Congo. And so he went, like people might expect, to his manager and said, hey, something isn't right here. Elder Dempster was being paid by King Leopold II, tried to hush the discoveries that E.D. Morel had made, and ultimately he quit his job and became one of the public leaders of the anti-slavery movement, specifically focused on the Belgian Congo. So what I like about that story is it's such a good example of the power of looking at whose voice is missing. Even in something as potentially dull and mundane as an accounting ledger book from 1890 whatever. My second story is much more recent and comes from a nonprofit organization that I was recently talking to. They were giving a presentation that I was attending. I'm not going to use their real name, nor am I going to use their real data set or any of their real content for reasons that will become apparent in a moment. I've made a sanitized mock-up of something that gets the point across and is close enough to what they're doing to make the point. This is an organization that works with trying to create economic opportunities for women in a couple of developing countries. And in seeking to do this in a data-driven way, they went out and did a bunch of surveys and asked people, what's preventing you from getting access to the opportunities that you need? And this is like I say, this is not real data. This is a vague representation of what they came back with. There is a fundamental flaw in this representation, and it is not the pie chart. I'm not here to make snarky comments about the pie chart. I feel like that would be an uncontroversial thing for me to say to this audience. Our hatred for pie charts is well documented. The issue here is kind of a little bit more insidious than the pie chart. It's the fact that just by virtue of how they framed this question, they're implying that there is only one way that any given respondent to this survey can be excluded from the job market. When in reality, if they had framed this question a little bit differently and taken a more intersectional approach to looking at this problem, they would have found every individual's challenges are much more nuanced and probably very layered. It is super plausible that someone would be struggling not to find a job in their field and not have their family's permission. Just this simple shift in framing and setting the terms of that conversation in a way that accommodates the nuances of every one would have given them a much better result. My next story comes from another nonprofit organization. This is one I will name. This is an organization that is a global giving partner. Their acronym is WAND, which stands for Water, Agroforestry, Nutrition, and Development. They are based in the Philippines, founded by a woman named Cora and her husband Elmer. This is him in the picture here. And they do a lot of different work, different projects, but the story that I want to tell relates to their response to Typhoon Haiyan, which is a superstorm that hit the Philippines in 2013. And as is typical in a lot of disaster situations, there is an event, and immediately there is an influx of international organizations who come in to stabilize the situation, especially in the immediate hours, days, first couple weeks after the disaster, taking care of very basic response needs, which is exactly what happened in the area affected by the typhoon. Those international NGOs came in, identified that sanitation was going to be a problem here, and built rows upon rows of latrines. That they knew that was a need, a very kind of basic one they had to address. Great, we've got it taken care of. However, the problem here was that, as Cora and Elmer pointed out, no one involved in the process of building all those latrines had ever thought to ask the communities living there what the culturally appropriate toilet would have been for them to implement. And so as a result, they had rows upon rows of latrines that nobody was comfortable using. And just imagine, if you're in a situation where potentially your house has been destroyed, you don't have a great place to live, going to the bathroom is a really intimate thing if you're not going to use a latrine that you're not comfortable with. And so what happened was, fairly quickly after these international NGOs came in and built these organizations, WAND, led by people who were part of the communities that were affected, deeply, deeply understood the importance of co-creation in terms of creating solutions with their peers in the community. Came in and worked on this project that you see here, which is retrofitting these latrines with the toilets that people were comfortable with. It seems like such a silly thing, but I can't overstate enough the importance of co-creation and listening very, very deeply with the to the members and the individuals in the communities who you seek to serve, whether you work in a nonprofit context or any other context, including data science. My last short story I want to talk about today isn't so much as a story as just amplifying, I think, a really insightful way to think about this that comes from two data leaders who I really admire. This is Ben Green. Ben Green is a PhD student at Harvard who will add to the required reading list his recent paper, Data Science as a Political Action. The whole thing is great, but I want to call out a specific point that he makes about neutrality, because this gets us back to our theme of power. Very frequently, and I think for good reason, data scientists are inclined to position themselves as neutral arbiters. We don't want to create models that are biased. In fact, we seek to strip bias out of all of our models. We don't want to put our thumbs on the scale one way or another. And what Green points out here is that mindset of neutrality implicitly leads us to a place where we are favoring what currently exists. Because if it didn't currently exist, we wouldn't have to, we wouldn't be needing to shift our thinking accordingly. So this may not be a problem, but it might be. And I think it's very easy to just kind of let this go and say, oh, I'm just a data scientist, I'm here to do the analysis, and then pass it on to the decision makers to do with as they will. I think we have to be so mindful of the power that comes along with this, because if we're not, it can lead to what Anna Lauren Hoffman, formerly of the iSchool here, now at the University of Washington, describes as data violence. This is what happens when this idea of neutrality is allowed to, when this idea of neutrality allows existing injustices that are baked into the underlying social constructs, sources of data, et cetera, to continue to do damage to large populations of people. So this is the last thing I want to call out as far as places where both power and framing become critically important in thinking about doing data with everyone instead of doing data for good. And I think the overall theme that is consistent through all of these stories, just to start to wrap things up, frequently when I go home for Thanksgiving, I'll have conversations with my family about what I do. And my aunt will say things like, oh, You're doing Moneyball for nonprofits. I wish it were that clean. Everybody agrees what it means to win a baseball game. And so that's a metric you can optimize for. You can build models around that. Everyone agrees on what the question is. It's much harder to get people to agree on what kind of latrine to build if you haven't talked to the people who are going to be using them. It's much harder to get people to agree on what it means for a model to be good. It's much harder to get people to agree on even what to optimize a model for when we're dealing with models that are trying to tackle really complex adaptive challenges, like how do we improve the economic opportunities for women in a developing country. These are not easy tasks to engage with, but I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful for lots of reasons, not the least of which is the fact that there's a whole room full of data leaders who are willing to engage with these kinds of questions immediately before lunch. This is important, and I think the fact that you're all here today is a really encouraging sign. So just to kind of wrap things up, what can you do when you head back to your organizations and the rest of your careers? Acknowledge the power that you have in framing the terms of the data conversation at your organizations. Really emphasize the idea of collaboration and co-creation with everyone in a way that embraces the nuance and the messiness associated with dealing with real human challenges. And if you're considering a role like mine in shifting your career to a more nonprofit or government context especially, don't fear the notion that you might be labeled a generalist. I think the previous talk talked about the importance of specializing, and I think that's really important if you're in an enterprise organization that has a lot of data scientists and has a well-defined problem. But the nature of these kinds of social problems is that they are multifaceted and that they require a lot of complementary skill sets within usually one or two people's roles to be able to engage with them. Any given day, I might be doing a little bit of the data engineering, a little bit of the data science, a little bit of, I wouldn't say I do data art, but maybe that's something I can aspire to. The chances are pretty good you're going to be more in that generalist category, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but it's something worth tracking as you're thinking about engaging with this. So if you leave here with nothing else today, I hope you leave with a healthy but loving skepticism of the term data for good, an awareness of the importance of power and framing, and an inclination to think about doing data with everyone. So thank you all so much.
Nick, that was great. Let's test that hypothesis that people are willing to engage with this just a few minutes before lunch and see if there are any questions around. So gentleman standing at the back, yeah, let's go there. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Nick. I've been working in the same space as you for the last 10 years, and one of the things I find really hard is organizational learning from context to context. So as we look at what the response was in the Philippines in 2013 to the kind of underwhelming response to what's going on in the cyclone in Southeast Africa last month. Using your platform, is there a way to learn and transition people's way to, whether they're giving or they're organizing, responses to that event? Is there a way to use your platform to learn across contexts and disasters?
It's a phenomenal question, and it's one that we engage with a lot. It gets to this idea of generalizability, which I think is something that is super important in, obviously, the data science world in terms of if you're running an experiment, how much can you trust those results in other contexts? I think that the same is true for different interventions in the social space I'm sure you've encountered. And it's equally true in terms of how people relate to different kinds of events. I think if I had a model to be able to predict, the proportional responses between those different kinds of disasters, we would be using it all the time. And we've tried to do that, but I think the nature of a lot of these different events is that the generalizability isn't there as much as we might like it to be. So I don't know that there are any easy answers to that, but that's something that we will continue to iterate on in the future, particularly in the disaster space for exactly the reasons you mentioned.
Other questions? Yes, so bring it down here. Thank you.
I know you've been asking us to move away from data for good to data with everyone, but there's still the question of the ethical dilemmas that arise from data for good. And the classic case is, I think, the autonomous vehicle algorithm that encounters an obstacle, and then on one side there's a school bus full of children, or something like that. So how do you handle? How do you tackle that kind of scenario?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question as well. I think the notion of doing data with everyone certainly applies to communities and individuals who are directly affected by the project that you're doing. But I think particularly in these situations where the data world may not have a clear answer, we can extend that idea of doing data with everyone to bring in ideas from other areas of expertise. I am not a philosopher, I'm not an ethicist. That's exactly the kind of problem that I would need to go and pull in people who are experts in those areas. I think the domain expertise from a diverse number of fields is very, very important, particularly as the problems that data scientists engage with like that have impacts beyond just, who's going to see this ad. There's no easy answers there, which is why I think the more diverse voices we can get in the conversation, the better off we'll be.
Okay. Time for one more question. Gentleman standing at the back. Thank you.
Hey, Nick, I imagine we'll talk about this over lunch, so thanks so much for the talk. I guess I want to, you and I have spoken a little bit about the importance of serving in sort of a translational role between technical experts and the people who actually do the work. And I love the idea of data with everyone, but I'm grappling with it because the bias of people who are doing data scientists is towards technological solutions and the mechanisms for getting the thing done. And in my experience in global development, a lot of times, again, it's the relationships that make the difference, right? And you don't lead with a technological solution, you lead with the question that people are asking, the pain that they're feeling, the solution that they bring up, right? And so I feel like there is this fundamental tension between the mindsets being brought by the people inclined to be in this room and the sort of the way relationships and knowledge and things like that are constructed in the developing world. And I'm curious how you propose bridging that gap, because it's easy to say, all right, I'm on board, I'm going to do data with everyone. That doesn't mean I can actually speak the language. And I don't mean in terms of like English versus French versus Chichewa. I mean, speak the language in terms of having enough shared experience with the people who need to be consulted to actually be able to communicate in a meaningful way, right? So who do you see doing that, or how do you propose we get there, starting from where we are now?
Yeah, I think the way that I have, at least in my role, tried to navigate that, because I agree that it's absolutely a problem. The inclination that I think many of us have is I want to build a really cool model to do that thing, and you get super sucked into your Jupyter notebook, and that's fun. I get it. I've done it. I think that's where the idea of co-creation with a large number of diverse individual voices helps keep that in check. And building, someone talked earlier about the importance of building process along with technology. I think building process that has natural opportunities for those voices to weigh in on the thing that you're building naturally kind of helps keep you from getting too deep in the weeds. It's not to say that that's a panacea by any means, but I think that is like the first basic thing that I would suggest people do. It's what I've found has been really valuable within our organization. I definitely want to talk more about that at lunch.
All right. Nick, thank you so much.
Thank
Please
you.
join me in thanking Nick.